Elizabeth Barrett Browning. During her lifetime, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was one of England's most famous poets. Passionately admired by contemporaries as diverse as John Ruskin, Algernon Charles Swinburne, and Emily Dickinson for her moral and emotional ardor and her energetic engagement with the issues of her day, she was better known than her husband, Robert Browning, at the time of her death. Her work fell into disrepute with the modernist reaction against what was seen as the inappropriate didacticism and rhetorical excess of Victorian poetry. But recently scholars interested in her exploration of what it means to be a woman poet and in her response to social and political events have restored her status as a major writer. Barrett Browning received an unusual education for a woman of her time. Availing herself of her brother's tutor, she studied Latin and Greek. She read voraciously in history, philosophy, and literature, and began to write poetry from an early age. Her first volume of poetry was published when she was 13. But as her intellectual and literary powers matured, her personal life became increasingly circumscribed both by ill health and by a tyrannically protective father, who had forbidden any of his 11 children to marry. But at the age of 39, Elizabeth Barrett was a prominent woman of letters who lived in semi-seclusion as an invalid in her father's house, where she occasionally received visitors in her room. One of these visitors was Robert Browning, who, moved by his admiration of her poetry, wrote to tell her, "I do, as I say, love these books with all my heart, and I love you too." He thereby initiated a courtship that culminated in 1846 in their secret marriage and elopement to Italy, for which her father never forgave her. In Italy, Barrett Browning regained much health and strength, bearing and raising a son, Pen, to whom she was ardently devoted, and becoming deeply involved in Italian nationalist politics. She and her husband made their home in Florence, at the house called Casa Guidi, where she died in 1861. Barrett Browning's poetry is characterized by a fervent moral sensibility. In her early work, she tended to use the visionary modes of romantic narrative poetry, but she turned increasingly to contemporary topics, particularly to liberal causes of her day. For example, in 1843, when government investigations exposed the exploitation of children employed in coal mines and factories, she wrote The Cry of the Children, a powerful indictment of the appalling use of child labor. Like Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, Barrett Browning uses literature as a tool of social protest and reform, lending her voice, for example, to the cause of American abolitionism in The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. In later poems, she took up the cause of the Risorgimento, the movement to unify Italy as a nation-state, in which Italy's struggle for freedom and identity found resonance with her own. For many years, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was best known for her Sonnets from the Portuguese, 1850, a sequence of 44 sonnets presented under the guise of a translation from the Portuguese language, in which she recorded the stages of her love for Robert Browning. But increasingly, her verse novel Aurora Leigh, 1857, has attracted critical attention. The poem depicts the growth of a woman poet and is thus, as Cora Kaplan observes, the first work in English by a woman writer in which the heroine herself is an author. When Barrett Browning first envisioned the poem, she wrote, "My chief intention just now is the writing of a sort of novel poem, running into the midst of our conventions and rushing into drawing rooms and the like where angels fear to tread, and so, meeting face to face and without mask the humanity of the age, and speaking the truth as I conceive of it out plainly." The poem is a portrait of the artist as a young woman committed to a socially inclusive realist art. It is a daring work both in its presentation of social issues concerning women and in its claims for Aurora's poetic vocation. On her 20th birthday, to pursue her career as a poet, Aurora refuses a proposal of marriage from her cousin Romney, who wants her to be his helpmate in the liberal causes he has embraced. Later in the poem, she rescues a fallen woman and takes her to Italy, where they settle together and confront a chastened Romney. Immensely popular in its own day, Aurora Leigh had extravagant admirers, like Ruskin, who asserted that it was the greatest poem written in English, and critics who found fault with both its poetry and its morality. With its crowded canvas and melodramatic plot, it seems closer to the novel than to poetry, but it is important to view the poem in the context of the debate about appropriate poetic subject matter that engaged other Victorian poets. Unlike Matthew Arnold, who believed that the present age had not produced actions heroic enough to be the subject of great poetry, and unlike Alfred Lord Tennyson, who used Arthurian legend to represent contemporary concerns, Barrett Browning felt that the present age contained the materials for an epic poetry. Virginia Woolf writes that Elizabeth Barrett was inspired by a flash of true genius when she rushed into the drawing room and said that here, where we live and work, is the true place for the poet. Aurora Leigh succeeds in giving us what Woolf describes as a sense of life in general, of people who are unmistakably Victorian, wrestling with the problems of their own time, all brightened, intensified, and compacted by the fire of poetry. Aurora Leigh, with her passionate interest in social questions, her conflict as artist and woman, her longing for knowledge and freedom, is the true daughter of her age.